But he had cousins who would be called brothers and sisters as his nearest kinsmen, as was the custom in ancient Hebrew society. Even the Protestants like Hengstenberg see this so clearly, but there's a whole lot more to see here, because he says to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple asked her to walk about 10 steps in front of him. Oh wait, I'm sorry. From that hour, the beloved disciple took her to his own home. Why? Jesus wasn't playing favorites. He didn't name John, but the beloved disciple, because John knows that he's merely a symbol, a sign that points to all of us. All of us are beloved disciples. All of us are called to suffer with Jesus. All of us are called to the foot of the cross. All of us are called to stand beside Mary and to take her into our homes from the very hour that Christ offers himself in this hour. We need a mother. And we're not ashamed of the gift that Jesus gave her. We're not ashamed of her at all. Now, I'd like to focus upon Mary as the Queen Mother of the Son of David, and our special focus will be the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2, along with Revelation 11 and 12. In Genesis 3, we read in verses 14 and 15, "The curse pronounced upon the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all cattle and above all wild animals. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat." This is what God has promised for the serpent: a crushing defeat, a humiliation. He will eat the dust, as it is in Psalm 72, "The Davidic kings shall conquer their enemies and make them lick the dust. Dust shall be their food." And it goes on to say in verse 15, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." Zerah in Hebrew, sperma in Greek. It is a curious expression that associates seed not with the male but the female. More on that later. And it goes on to describe how he shall crush the head and you shall bruise the heel. Once again, another foreshadowing of how God will bring the humiliating defeat, the crushing humiliation upon the serpent. It's interesting because as I have studied this passage over the years, I have discovered much very similar to what Dr. Ed Sri discovered in his dissertation, Queen Mother, a biblical theology of Mary's queenship. Ed is a good friend of mine, a former student who just defended this dissertation in Rome earlier this year. And what he found, I discovered to be most interesting, that when biblical scholars apply themselves to the terminology and the imagery in Genesis 3:15, where the woman and her seed shall crush the head of the serpent, biblical scholars have come away looking at that in its ancient historical light, and they see, quote, "The woman of Genesis 3:15 is a prototypical queen mother figure. Where Eve failed, a new Eve will succeed. Where the first queen mother sinned, a new queen mother will arise in righteousness." He quotes authors Cazell, Robert, Fouillet, Laurentin, Stuhlmuller, and many others. No doubt the queen mother has her place here in Genesis 3:15. She is clearly the queen mother from whom royal offspring will arise to crush the serpent's head. So what we find in the Davidic kingdom is the restoration of what God established in the creation kingdom, way back in the beginning. And every time God steps in to renew his covenant, he makes it more and more clear what he plans to do. In Genesis 17, as we move from Adam to Abraham, we move from Eve to Sarah. And in Genesis 17, verse 16, we discover that God is not just interested in working with the man, Abraham, but the woman, Sarah. There we read, "And God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." So that in Sarah we have the beginning of a dynastic promise that God has made. Kings of peoples shall come from Sarah. But Abraham and Sarah had to wait a long time for a son. They end up having to wait an even longer time to see the fulfillment of this promise of kings coming forth from her line. But the promise keeps working in human history, and the biblical record gives us spiritual insight into what is really going on behind the political scenes. There is a promise that as the serpent used the woman to bring the human family into disgrace, so God will use a new woman to bring humiliation and defeat to the serpent. And this woman is going to be used, as Genesis 3:15 describes and announced beforehand, to bring a crushing blow to the head of the serpent. Not surprisingly, ancient Israel scriptures anticipate what this will look like as kingdoms rise up against Israel. If you have a pad and a pen, just jot this down. Judges 4 and Judges 9. In the book of Judges, Israel has entered the promised land after the Exodus. They have begun to conquer the Canaanites. But there is one Canaanite king who is very powerful, and he has set his military commander, an army general named Sisera, against the Israelite armies. And Sisera is winning. And yet a woman named Deborah, a prophetess, predicts that through a woman shall come a crushing defeat to this little puppet of the devil named Sisera. And sure enough, as we continue reading in Judges 4, against all odds, God raises up Barak, whose name in Hebrew means blessing. God raises up a blessing to bring the curse to the serpent's seed. And after a battle, Sisera is defeated. He's about to get captured, but he flees in haste and he gets away. No one knows where the general is hiding, and everybody is afraid of what he might do when he comes out of hiding. He's alone in a tent where he is being kept by a woman named Jael. In Judges 4:17, Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael. And there he takes a nap. And while he naps, what happens? Jael took a tent peg and a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple till it went down into the ground as he lay asleep from weariness. So the head of this little serpent was crushed by a woman, bringing defeat to the kingdom that warred against God's people. Once again, this happens in Judges 9, where you have Gideon, who is named Jerubbaal, and he had a son named Abimelech through a concubine. Abimelech aspired to be a king, but he was really a corrupt ruler. Before he could even take the crown, he had to slaughter 70 of his half-brothers. And then he imposed his authority upon the 12 tribes of Israel, insisting that he would be king. And his tyranny prevailed for a while, until God raised up a woman to humiliate Abimelech, and Abimelech's defeat came through what? A certain woman threw an upper millstone upon Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Again and again in ancient Israel's history, there is an anticipation or a foreshadowing of how God will raise up a woman to bring humiliation and defeat to those that the serpent uses to keep us from salvation. But the thing I would like to zero in on, the thing that I would like to focus your attention upon even more closely, is an institution that arose at the same time the Davidic kingdom was established by God's covenant. God raised up David as a shepherd, a man after God's own heart. He gave him the power to defeat the enemies of Israel, and he established his dynasty by a covenant described in 2 Samuel 7.